Hey guys, so my name is Gavin. I'm founder of an email encryption company called Jumble, and I'm going to talk about some information security topics, and it's going to cover developer security and operational security. This is a huge area of interest, so it's going to be very high level and very much an introduction, not advanced. So we're going to look at developer security, some of the major threats and hacks that people are facing and how to mitigate those. And also on the operational side, some design, configuration and monitoring, and then some of the tools and resources that you can use across both of those. So security is pretty serious. You don't want to get hacked. If you think about Barack Obama's emails getting hacked, or the Sony hack that everybody has probably seen, but it's not sexy, so a lot of people don't care about it. A lot of businesses don't invest the time or money needed to appropriately defend against it because there's no direct output or tangible gain from it. It's kind of like an insurance policy. But everybody really should care because everybody is vulnerable to something, whether you realize it or not. And if you operate any kind of business or online presence or website, you've always got something to lose, whether you believe so or not, you always do. So jumping straight into developer security, there's a lot of methodologies and processes for secure coding and secure development. I'm not going to go into it. They're huge fields. So I'll leave you just with these two links. OWASP, if you haven't seen it, is a great resource. You should definitely check it out. And also the Microsoft has a very nice secure development lifecycle, which covers loads of things from the foundations and principles to attack surface analysis and development and risk modeling. So I'm not going to go into those, but definitely check them out. So jumping straight into some of the most common threats that developers will see or will be hit with, we're going to just look at what these are at a very high level, examples and how to defend against them. And I think you'll probably see that a lot of the ways to defend against them are actually very, very common, so that makes things a little bit easier. So SQL injection, everybody's probably heard of it, but maybe not a lot of people know what it is. Essentially, if you don't validate input coming from a user, you can expose everything from your database to anybody. And this is done by injecting an attack string, which will break the original query as designed by the developers, using form data submitted on maybe a registration page or a login page. So here's a very quick and trivial example. If we have an SQL query with select star from users where user ID is equal to some variable that was sent in a login form. And then we can insert an attack string where we have Bob and a single quote, or 1 equals to 1, and then a new query which is drop table users, and then we finish with a double hyphen. And what this does is, there may or may not be a user Bob, that's irrelevant, but then we add a condition to the query that will always be true. We close the query and then start a new one, and then that's the attack payload. The double query at the end then is quite important, or the double hyphen is quite important because that then creates a comment in the SQL statement and then safely escapes any of the remaining query that the developers designed in the original query. So down the bottom is what actually gets run in the database. So select star from users where the user ID is Bob or 1 equals to 1. That's always going to be true. You can get data from that. And then we have the attack payload, which is dropping the user's table. And the double hyphen then escapes the remainder of the original query. So it's a pretty dangerous attack. Luckily, it's quite easy to defend against. I can't strongly enough recommend using known development frameworks like Ruby on Rails, Cake PHP, Spring, whatever it is that's appropriate for your language. A lot of frameworks will use prepared statements and various other mechanisms to make sure that you defend against this. And also validating input is crucially important. You always want to know that what you're taking into your system is what you expect. And as a general rule of thumb, you can never trust your users or any client of your system. They could be sending anything, so you got to validate all the time. And that's going to be the same over and over and over as validation. So broken authentication is leaking sensitive information. This often happens by storing passwords in plain text in a database, having really poor cookie or session handling, maybe by putting a session ID in the URL, or unvalidated page flow designs. All of this is just quite bad because you essentially assume that users will behave as you want them to, which is not going to be the case once a malicious attacker comes into your infrastructure. So here's a very simple example, and this might look silly and trivial, but you'd be amazed at how many sites and applications actually use this, and they put session IDs and sensitive tokens relating to a session in a URL. And maybe just to explain this, if I can get that session ID, I can hijack your session, and if you're maybe in the middle of an online purchase, I can get your credit card, buy something else that you didn't expect. So never put anything sensitive in URLs, and I would also say use SSL, use encryption as much as is absolutely possible. So yeah, no sensitive data in URLs, only use HTTP cookies, don't allow your cookies to be interrogated by script. A very nice mechanism is use change your session ID after login, and don't store passwords in a readable format. Hash them if you must save them, or use OAuth or federated logins. Cross-site scripting, also called XSS, is a really nice attack where you make one victim attack another victim. And this can be done in one of two ways, either by a stored persistent attack or by what's called reflective or a drive-by attack. In the stored one, we assume that an attacker is able to compromise the server and inject an attack payload into something like a CMS, so some type of content that will be rendered out to more clients in the future. And then when it's rendered on another client, it then attacks them back. And it could do things like steal cookies, steal credit card information, and send it off to a third-party server. In the drive-by attack is kind of, if you think about maybe malicious email campaigns where think of a HTML email and you have an image, and the source of the image points to an attack payload on a malicious server, and when the browser or email client tries to open the image, it executes the payload. So that's why a lot of email clients will not render images by default. So here we have an example, and this is it's kind of a difficult attack to defend against because of all the ways that you can deliver the payload. You can use, just in the first example, you can use just plain JavaScript, and if you think of this, first line was injected into a CMS when it's represented back to the user, we can grab a cookie. But in the bottom one, it's much more difficult to defend against because we can encode it in base64 or URI encoding, which means validating inputs become very, very difficult. But you can, of course, defend against it. The big thing is validation on input and output. Development frameworks, again, will go a long way to defending against this. And try to limit how much user input you render on a page. So if you have a login form and the error message for failed logins, don't put the user input in that. So bob@gmail.com is not a valid user. You just say login failed. This is an attack not a lot of people know about, but again, it's quite common. The example is trivial, but it's a very, very much a real-world scenario. It's where you expose information of actual real-world objects in URLs that can then be manipulated. So in this example, we're transferring money from the account 123456 to another account. So it should be pretty obvious that if you can just tweak the URL, you can change the from or to account and steal money or transfer money to other people. So defending against this is pretty easy. You just use arbitrary references and map those back to actual real-world objects on your server side. Some lesser-known threats, and I won't go into as much detail because we kind of push for time. A lot of people will jump straight into a development project, especially in smaller companies, without kind of doing enough research on the frameworks, the languages, or the servers or packages that they're going to use. You should always be educated as to the health status of the software that you're using. So if you're using Apache or Rails or whatever, make sure that you're not using versions with major known vulnerabilities. There will likely always be vulnerabilities, but make sure that there's no major ones. And a major issue is data leakage. The first thing that an attacker will do when orchestrating an attack is discovery of a target. And And that's trying to figure out, where's it hosted, what's the infrastructure, what's the server. Because if an attacker wants to attack Google, it might look up and see, well, is it running an Apache server? Then look up the Apache version and see what are the major vulnerabilities. And then implementing an attack becomes quite easy. So try and limit how much information you reveal about your server that's not necessary for your users. And then a big one is remote code execution. This is very nasty. If you can break the server by passing in data it doesn't expect, you can then cause overflows. And this is quite common, or at least used to be very common in Apache or any servers using C and C++. If you have, again, it all comes back to unvalidated inputs. You flow in more data than the server was expecting. You cause an overflow, and you can then run any arbitrary code that you want and get full shell access to the system. So that's the end of the developer section. Here's some tools. OWASP is an absolutely brilliant reference for anything to do with security. There's development guides, cheat sheets, and WebGoat is very nice. It's a intentionally vulnerable web app to try out attacks on and re-implement and see if you're vulnerable as well. Also, some more simple tools. The Chrome Inspector in Google Chrome is just awesome, and if you want to see what's actually happening in your network traffic, it's very good. Burp Suite is a very nice tool. There's a little bit of a learning curve, but it's excellent. And WebSecurify is a very, very nice tool and takes a lot of the learnings away from the user, and you can just point it at a server and kind of attack it from an educational perspective. So a little bit about operational security, and I guess why operational security is important is that there's no point going to great lengths from a development perspective if your server's root password is password or you've no firewalls, for example. So you are only as secure as your weakest link in the chain. I'm not going to go into this. This is a massive area of expertise in itself, and the point of this diagram is to just kind of give you a flavor for that. Everything we've spoken about so far is contained in the top box. So all the rest of the boxes cover everything from physical security, personnel, to firewalls, to virus protection, to intrusion detection and prevention. It's a massive area, and it's one that shouldn't be underestimated. Some of this may be overkill for smaller companies, but definitely the kind of the boxes closer to the top absolutely are applicable. So just some points to consider when designing systems. Try to design tiered architectures. It reduces your risk and your exposure. If you have less visible and available publicly on the web, there's less attack surface and greatly reduces your chances of being exploited. Absolutely use demilitarized zones, lock down networks, and only allow controlled traffic flows where they're expected and where they're valid. And when you're adding all of these items, you've got to make sure that you're using fairly secure configurations. And some of this stuff is kind of easy, but some of it maybe just doesn't occur to people. Very, very simple things like changing default ports. You probably don't want your SSH ports to be 22 and your MySQL port to be 3306. Every developer on the planet knows this, that they're the ports, so change them to something arbitrary. It makes it a little bit harder. You just don't make things easy for attackers. Use firewalls and reverse proxies as much as possible. Absolutely do use application firewalls. Mod security is excellent. And in your tiered architecture, when you have demilitarized zones, make sure that traffic only flows where it's meant to flow. So you shouldn't have open public web access outbound from your database, for example. That's never valid. So if somebody jumps into your database somehow, you don't want them to be able to export all the data back out. So for a lot of small companies or startups, this is often what products look like on the web. Initially, you have maybe one or a couple of web app servers and a database probably sitting on the same app servers, and they're all directly exposed on the internet, which is quite bad. And then for maybe slightly more mature systems, you'll have a database on a different server. But this is what most people do, and especially with cloud computing, it's so easy to launch a node. You can get stuff live very, very quickly, but you can then ignore a lot of the security pitfalls that go with that. So kind of this is what a lot of startups will do, or developers, but something a little bit, maybe not quite as complicated, but definitely in the same type of a structure is what people should be aiming for, which is, I'm sorry, the resolution seems quite bad, but what it's trying to represent is load balancers, proxies, controlled network flows, and locked off zones where you're handling anything really sensitive like payment information. So all of this is great, but unless you've got monitoring and alerting in place, you don't really know what's happening in the system. So are you being attacked? How often, how frequent have attackers been successful? You need to put in monitoring, reporting, and alerting so that you can respond. This is meant to be a screenshot of logs from mod security. And what I was trying to illustrate is that while there's a lot of very useful information here, it's not really consumable given the wealth of information that we're all kind of drowning in every day. So we can get very simple tools, some of them free, some of them not, that will make all of this a lot more consumable. So if anybody has heard of Splunk, is a log index and management system. We can use Splunk with mod security audit logs and get a mod security add-in for Splunk that gives you an attack dashboard to see what sort of attacks, where they're coming from, how often they're hitting, and then you can jump in and query them really, really trivially. It'll also show you geographically where are these attacks coming from, which is quite useful as well, because you might start blacklisting countries, blacklisting IPs or IP ranges. So some tools. Mod security and mod evasive, I really can't recommend them highly enough. Obviously firewalls, there's a bunch that you can use at the network level. There's application firewalls. Monitoring, you can get a lot of very simple and free monitoring tools like Monit. You get it set up in like 10 minutes. Likewise, Uptime Robot is free. And these kind of things will monitor your host, your applications, tell you when something's up, down, restarted, process has changed. If you're using Amazon, you've got all the AWS alerts. And then again, for monitoring and alerting, Splunk, mod security, Loggly, Logstash. There's lots of tools. A lot of them are free, but you should definitely have some of these in place in your infrastructure. Again, same tools over for alerting. So this has been very, very quick, and it's a huge area in itself, more than really anybody can properly convey in 15 minutes. But I guess my hope for this is that you would maybe see some topics and maybe go and learn more about them and at least be aware of them. But if I can leave you with these couple of points, is that security is very hard. If you have a breach, that data will never, ever, ever die. So if you lose your user's database, and it's going to float out on the web at some point or other, and you've all probably seen that with the Ashley Madsen leaks that were happened, or the data was released about 2 weeks ago. And so in our own work, some stats that we've come across have been that, you can see the numbers here, 74% of small companies and 90% of large that have been surveyed by a major research institution have reported attacks in 2014. So it's really not a case of if you're attacked, but when. You should assume that you're going to be attacked at some point. And if you look at your web server logs, I can bet you're going to see failed SSH or maybe even successful SSH logins coming into your box at least daily. So it's probably already happening. The question is, do you know about it, and are you protecting against it? So that's it from me, and I'd be happy to talk to if anybody wants to know more about this or wants a copy.